whatever the outcome this election day, a question will linger. Has a man been elected to the U.S. presidency without having been born in the USA? That's a question addressed now by our Rocca.
The rumors persist. Was the president actually born in the U.S.? And if he wasn't, what does that say about President Chester Alan Arthur? Who did you think I was talking about? Our 21st president, Chester Alan Arthur, is remembered as much for his outlandish facial hair as he is for his outlandish facial hair.
It's really awful. I would have been cutting those off in his sleep.
Yeah, no, it's a little much. But when Arthur became president in 1881, the whispers surrounding him were about more than his whiskers. Democrats claimed that Arthur, a Republican, wasn't born in Vermont, as he maintained, but in Canada, which according to the Constitution made him ineligible for the Oval Office. The charge was never proven, but even today there are those who say it's true.
So this is the birthplace of Chester A. Arthur, 1829.
Heather Darch says that Arthur was born in this modest house in the town of Bedford, in French-speaking Canada, just 15 miles north of the U.S. border. It's not often that a presidential birthplace comes up for sale.
I know. I think Americans could come up here and own a piece of Americana very easily.
And you are fairly convinced that he was born here?
Yeah, I am actually. I really do believe that Chester A. Arthur was America's first Canadian president.
Okay, this is basically the research room.
Just down the road in the village of Stanbridge East, Darch and Judy Antle oversee the region's archives. If we're investigating the question of where Chester Arthur was actually born, this is a good place to come?
This would be the place to come, yes.
This much we know. Chester's father, William Arthur, was an itinerant minister and teacher who traveled back and forth across the very porous border. And when his son, the future president, was born, this was a schoolhouse.
Right.
Where Chester Alan Arthur's father was teaching in 1829?
Right, exactly.
The year that he was born?
Right.
Right here in Canada?
Exactly. Our records indicate that this house has always been known as the White House.
Ironic.
Yeah, very.
What's more, the family of Chester's mother, Malvina, was living nearby in Canada at the time of his birth.
Malvina, we know, already had children, so she would have needed someone to look after the children while she was nursing a new baby. So very likely that she went to her mother for help and assistance. So yes, it's very likely that Chester was born here.
And then there's this. Chester Alan Arthur lied about the year of his birth till the day he died. And he refused to answer questions raised by the birthers of his time.
If he was born in the States, why was it such a big cover-up? Why didn't things just come out into the open? Why is it still an issue right now, and why is it still a mystery?
Not surprisingly, 30 miles south in Fairfield, Vermont, the locals at Chester's Bakery stand by their namesake as made in America. Now, the people over in Quebec that we've spoken to, the Canadians, say that they know that he was born over there.
Fairfield people know that he was born here. We have a pamphlet right in the window said, born in Fairfield.
Well, they've got pamphlets in Canada.
They must have lied.
Granted, the pamphlets are in French, so I couldn't...
So you couldn't read it, right? Ours are in English, and it says, born here in Fairfield.
We travel down Chester Arthur Road to the Chester Arthur Historic Site, which used to be called the Birthplace, to investigate. Do you think there's at least a chance that he was born in Canada?
No. Well, yes, there is a chance, but I doubt it.
John Dumville is in charge of Vermont's historic sites. Is it possible that Chester Alan Arthur was born in Kenya?
No. Come on.
Fairfield's town clerk, Amanda Forbes, showed us this record indicating that Chester's father, William, was elected to a local school board months before his son's birth in 1829. This is sort of as good as it gets in terms of evidence.
Right, we don't have any concrete birth certificate. I wish we did, but we don't.
The The truth may be lost to time and to the fact that Chester Alan Arthur burned all of his papers right before he died. What would the average Canadian say if he or she found out that Chester Arthur was actually Canadian?
I think that you would first have to tell them who he was.
They probably don't have any idea.
No. And then they might be pretty thrilled.
I think they'd be pleased.
James Buchanan was in this house when he was notified he won the election to the presidency.
Betty Nauman has been giving tours of Wheatland, the Lancaster, Pennsylvania estate of President James Buchanan, for close to 30 years.
The portrait of James Buchanan was done early in his campaign.
It's a gorgeous home with one very special amenity.
It has 2 adult seats, probably a seat for a teenager down there. And
that Wheatland's director, Patrick Clark, showed us. Oh my God, an outhouse for 5. You could have a whole cabinet meeting in here.
The family that goes together.
But it's in the proverbial toilet where historians rank our 15th president.
Oh, he's definitely the worst.
The worst ever?
The worst president ever.
Robert Strauss wrote a book about Buchanan.
Ah, here's Buchanan.
He's also got a cigar box filled with presidential action figures.
Here's Jackson. You remember when they talked to each other?
Oh, but Jackson hated Buchanan, right?
Jackson hated Buchanan.
Of course, not everyone hated Buchanan. After all, he was elected president in 1856. But this Northern Democrats' sympathies with the slave-holding South exacerbated long-simmering tensions, setting the stage for the Civil War. Yet at Wheatland, they're not quite so hard on the guy. Where would you put James Buchanan in the ranking of the 43 men who have occupied the Oval Office?
Probably 42nd.
He had an opportunity to write a book. Don't they all write a book?
If Buchanan is remembered at all, it's for being the bachelor president, the only one never to marry. Let's just get this out of the way right now.
Okay.
What was the deal with James Buchanan?
He did have a bad relationship early on. His fiancée probably committed suicide.
Because he was gay?
Well, maybe so.
There's no evidence to say that he was gay, but there's no evidence to prove that he was a heterosexual either.
But there's plenty of evidence that he knew how to throw a great party.
He threw the best party of the middle part of the 19th century, the inaugural ball. 6,000 people show up.
And Buchanan seemed worth celebrating. Buchanan had quite a resume.
The greatest of anybody who's ever run for president. He served in both houses of the Pennsylvania State Legislature, served in both houses of the U.S. Congress. He was an ambassador to Russia, ambassador to Great Britain. He was also Secretary of State.
There were high hopes at the beginning of his administration?
I think so, but they were dashed pretty quickly.
Only 2 days after his inauguration, the Supreme Court handed down the infamous Dred Scott decision, allowing that escaped slaves be forcibly returned to their owners. Buchanan backed that decision. Slavery would be the country's and his undoing.
He feared that if you handled the issue of slavery too robustly, that it would create what he believed would be the end of the Union, secession.
And that's exactly what happened. After Lincoln's election, but before his inauguration, 7 states seceded, while a politically paralyzed Buchanan presided. When all these states start seceding, when the country is falling apart, what is his reaction?
His biggest reaction is his friends are leaving him because many of his cabinet are Southerners, many of his friends are Southerners.
So his biggest reaction is a personal one, like, guys, I thought we were all friends.
Yeah, I thought we were all friends.
The ensuing Civil War would become known as Buchanan's War. What does Buchanan get right?
Well, what he gets right is not much, to tell you the truth.
Upon leaving Washington, it is said that Buchanan told incoming President Abraham Lincoln, "Sir, if you are as happy in entering the White House as I shall feel on returning to Wheatland, you are a happy man indeed."
He said to friends and family alike, I could well be the last president of these United States. Now, if you'll follow me, we're
Still, at 91, Betty Nauman doesn't plan on abandoning Buchanan or his home anytime soon.
I think this house keeps me young.
Well, James Buchanan did something right. (1876) was a banner year for America, the 100th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. A nationwide celebration with a full fifth of the country's population descending on Philadelphia for the Centennial Exposition. But beneath the revelry, there was a deep sense of unease.
This was the depths of a pretty serious economic depression. There was widespread unemployment. There were fairly violent labor disputes going on in various parts of the country.
And, says Columbia University history professor Eric Foner, the country was still feeling the aftershocks of the Civil War, which had ended only 11 years before.
There was still violence in the South, which had existed since the Civil War because of white supremacists' opposition to the giving of citizenship rights to the former slaves. So it was not a tranquil year, that's for sure.
1876 was also a presidential election year, and all of these issues, plus the rampant corruption in the administration of outgoing President Ulysses S. Grant, would factor into the contest.
It was a man who is faithful and true. Hayes is the man.
The Republicans ran Ohio Governor Rutherford B. Hayes. Was he charismatic?
I wouldn't say so.
This is a spectacular porch.
Yeah, Hayes joked that he wanted a porch with a house attached.
Dustin McLaughlin is the historian at the Rutherford B. Hayes Presidential Center in Fremont, Ohio.
He really exemplified that American tradition of the office seeks you, you don't seek it.
We have kind of the trifecta over here. We have General Grant, General Sherman, General Sheridan.
All great Union generals.
Yes, and all from Ohio as well.
Hayes's service as a general during the Civil War, says the center's executive director, Christy Weininger, was central to his identity.
He saw firsthand the passions that were behind the sectionalism that caused the Civil War. So I think that was always in the back of his mind, is how do we make this country feel united again?
Meanwhile, the Democrats were hungry to reclaim the White House, which they hadn't won in 20 years. Their candidate, New York Governor Samuel Tilden, a bachelor lawyer, had made his name fighting big city corruption.
Tilden and Hendricks, with Tilden and Hendricks, hurrah for Tilden and Hendricks.
The man was a bit lethargic, and quite frankly, a lot of people thought he was dull. Dull but dedicated.
His home sat across from New York City's Gramercy Park, and is today the National Arts Club, overseen by Robert Yonner.
I have to tell you, this house is kind of nicer than the White House. This house is a great Tilden legacy.
While both had beautiful homes, neither candidate, says Eric Foner, was exactly Mount Rushmore material.
There's another way of putting it. Both of them were basically mediocrities, politically.
Still, the turnout that November 7th remains the highest ever for a presidential election.
The turnout was 82% of eligible voters. That's extraordinary.
You had two political parties competing throughout the nation with people very loyal to them.
On election night, Tilden was ahead in the popular vote by 260,000 votes.
Hayes actually goes to bed believing Tilden had won, and he actually has interviews with reporters saying, I have lost. The Republican Party has to step in and tell him to stop saying that.
That's because Republican officials still saw a narrow path to victory for Hayes.
If Hayes could carry the three southern states where the results were not yet clear, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, he would win by one electoral vote. And they just issued a statement. Hayes has carried those states and is elected. And in a certain sense, it's almost like the 2000 election where Bush made an early claim of victory, even though it was so divided, and Gore never quite contested it properly.
And just as in the year 2000, America in 1876 woke up the morning after the election not knowing who had won. Inauguration back then was in early March, which meant the country had 4 months to figure out who would be its 19th president.
This election was flawed from top to bottom.
Massive voter fraud, says Foner, only added to the confusion.
There was violence throughout the South against African American voters to try to make it impossible for them to vote.
Black men, almost all of whom were Republican back then, had only recently won the right to vote, and Southern Democrats were actively suppressing that vote.
If there had been a fair election in the South, there's no question Hayes would have won by a large margin.
But as the weeks dragged on, neither side was willing to concede.
How tense did it get?
There were Democratic newspapers with headlines, "March to Washington to install Tilden as president." There were Republicans saying, "We're on the verge of another civil war."
Tilden or blood. This idea that if Tilden's not counted in, we might have another war, to fight here.
Was there a fear that there could be dueling presidencies?
Yes. There were key Democrats who asked Tilden to take the oath of office anyway. He refused to do so.
And there were a lot of people who said, particularly businessmen and others, who said, "We don't even care who's elected, but get this settled."
But Congress was divided, and the Constitution offered no clear direction for resolving the impasse. So in January of 1877, a 15-member Electoral Commission was formed. The 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats would determine which candidate won the states in dispute.
By some coincidence, all the electoral votes are allocated to Hayes by a vote of 8-7 in each case.
That's right. The commission voted along party lines.
But it's not over yet.
It's not over yet.
The Tilden camp cried foul. With inauguration just days away and the nation on edge, representatives for both candidates met in Washington for secret negotiations.
Ironically, they took place at Wormley House, a major hotel which is owned by a black man. Wormley, probably the most well-to-do African-American in the city of Washington at that time.
Ironic, because the agreement forged there, known as the Compromise of 1877, would have long-lasting repercussions for black Americans in the South.
The Democrats will not stop the inauguration of Hayes. They will accept Hayes as president. Hayes will end the remaining Reconstruction.
In other words, the Republicans get the White House, the Democrats effectively regain control of the American South. No more federal protection of the rights of recently freed African Americans.
The Democrats promise they will respect the basic rights of the former slaves, which they do not do.
Rutherford B. Hayes was certified as president on March 2, 1877. Samuel Tilden accepted the decision. 3 days later, Hayes was inaugurated in a peaceful transfer of power.
I think if either Hayes or Tilden had been of the personality that was very aggressive, that was very intense, really wanted this presidency for very selfish reasons, I think the whole tenor would have changed.
Today, says Christy Weininger, President Hayes is remembered less for what he did during his single term in office than for the election that threatened, once again, to tear apart the country.
Are visitors bringing up the election of 1876 more?
They're very interested in how divisive the country was then. And somehow knowing that we've been there before and survived, I think gives some comfort and some hope to people.
Worlds collided at the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago. Young and old. War and peace. Law and order.
You can't take that week in isolation. 68, one of the most dramatic and traumatic years in the nation's history.
It's on to Chicago and let's win there. Thank you.
They kind of all rolled to Chicago, and you could feel it coming.
Bill Daley, who would become President Obama's chief of staff, was a college student and spent the convention at the side of his father, Chicago Mayor Richard J. Daley.
We knew that there was going to be an enormous challenge on the streets, and my father believed that he was the defender of the city.
No more war! The peace groups are demanding permission to march on Convention Hall the night the Democrats nominate their candidate for president.
With thousands of protesters expected, 12,000 Chicago police officers were deployed along with the National Guard.
A Democratic convention is about to begin in a police state. There just doesn't seem to be any other way to say it.
The country was being torn apart by the Vietnam War.
Not long before joining CBS News, Bob Schieffer was a young reporter in 1968, attending his first national convention.
It was supposed to be a place where the Democrats were going to get their business all together, but everybody knew it was going to be difficult.
I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
President Johnson was forced out by the success of Senator Eugene McCarthy in New Hampshire. Robert Kennedy was assassinated the night he won the California primary. Vice President Hubert Humphrey didn't enter any primaries, but was favored to win the nomination.
Hubert Humphrey was the establishment, and he represented the big bosses and the traditional Democratic Party. The politicians, the big city mayors, they were certainly not satisfied with Gene McCarthy. His sole campaign was, "I'll end the war in Vietnam."
The city said in a year of assassinations and riots, it couldn't grant permits to protesters to march on the convention or sleep in city parks.
We knew the convention was coming to town, and we knew that there was probably going to be some problems. We were getting pelted.
Bill Giaconetti was a rookie policeman in 1968, posted to the protests in Grant Park.
I had come home from Korea. I was stationed on the DMZ, and the next trip, all my buddies went to Vietnam.
Wednesday night, August 28th, the confrontation that had been building all week, probably all year, burst open on the street between Grant Park and the convention headquarters hotel.
The first deputy said, "Clear the streets." After the final warning, he said, "If you don't move out of the street, my officers are going to clear the street." And that's what we had to do on that night.
They were just swinging their clubs like just a bunch of idiots.
The problem wasn't the regular people. The problem was the agitators, and there were a lot of them. My partner next to me, he caught a house brick in the chest. They had to take him to the hospital.
The notion that anybody came to the party with the idea of a big fight is wrong.
Marilyn Katz was the 23-year-old head of security for Students for a Democratic Society.
I understand that they felt that, one, they should keep control of their city, and that the Democratic Party and the mayor was saying, "We're counting on you to keep things in order." There was no excuse for beating us.
Did you ever see anyone throw anything at police officers?
Yes, I did. And if I had had something, I would have thrown it back too, because we had done nothing.
The violence in Grant Park was indeed seen all over the world and at the convention.
We've just received some film of the police and the demonstrators,
where anti-war delegates erupted.
And with George McGovern as President of the United States, we wouldn't have to have Gestapo tactics in the streets of Chicago.
Despite the uproar, Humphrey won the Democratic nomination by more than 1,000 votes. But
once all these riots had broken out and all this trouble had happened in Chicago, the nomination wasn't worth the paper it was written on.
When it goes that far, it's time to make a change.
Richard Nixon ran on a law and order platform and won the presidency in a close election. And at the end of 1968, a special commission called what happened that night on the streets of Chicago a police riot. Bill Giaconetti, who would be decorated in 1979 for taking 2 bullets to free 13 hostages, says,
"Well, it wasn't the police riot."
And Marilyn Katz, now a well-connected public relations executive, agrees.
I think that puts too much blame on the individual cops. I think that Daley made a mistake. He really wanted to maintain control of his city and demonstrate it.
Richard J. Daley would be reelected twice after 1968, but his actions at the Democratic Convention he brought home that year would stain his image in history and the party and city he loved.
Did your father ever have second thoughts about his actions or anything he should have done differently? Which
probably regretted getting the convention, but he never really said that. He was defensive around the police action because he thought that they were provoked, challenged. Yeah, he wished it didn't happen.
In the heat of emotion and riot, some policemen may have overacted.
But he was not somebody to go back and anguish over decisions made. In those times, with the energy, things were black and white. There was good, there was bad. Cops are bad, you know, demonstrators are good.
I remember.
Yeah, but life's more gray.
You don't have Nixon to kick around anymore.
It was hard to imagine in 1962 that Richard Nixon would be worth kicking around anymore. He'd lost one presidential election, and he just lost a second election to be governor of California.
Thank you, gentlemen, and good day.
Even Pat Buchanan, who would become one of Nixon's speechwriters, knew rehabilitating him would be tough.
He was a loser. He had lost and lost and lost. The only way you get rid of this loser image is to win.
But by 1968, the stage was being set for a law and order candidate like Richard Nixon.
The country was pre-revolutionary in 1968.
Historian Evan Thomas is the author of Being Nixon.
There were race riots, riots on campuses. The country was divided in a way that it had not been since the Civil War, worse than it is today.
Nixon's main Republican rivals, George Romney and Nelson Rockefeller, dropped out.
Nixon was lucky in that the Republican Party was falling apart around him. And Nixon, the old pro, was there to fill the vacuum.
So was Nixon lucky or good?
All great politicians are lucky and good, and Nixon was both.
Lucky for Nixon, the Democrats were being divided on the left by the Vietnam War and on the right by George Wallace, who was siphoning off voters attracted by his race-based populism.
These are the kind of folks that people are sick and tired of in this country all over the United States.
Nixon was ready to get kicked around again, but he still had a lot of kick left in him.
Those who have lost elections in the past have come back to win. I hope to come back to win.
The plan was to run against Lyndon Johnson, the incumbent president. But just 2 months after Nixon got into the race,
I shall not seek,
luckily for him,
and I will not accept,
everything changed.
the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Patrick Buchanan told Nixon that Johnson had dropped out.
Did he seem surprised?
Oh, he was stunned. Yeah. We were stunned.
Nixon accepted the Republican nomination in August of '68, just a few weeks before his biggest break yet.
Burning my credentials. The Democratic Party can't be democratic. I mean, what hope is there for democracy?
Democrats had their calamitous convention in Chicago, while the cops were outside clubbing demonstrators on the head. Delegates were inside, shooting themselves in the foot.
Enforce order in the convention.
Nixon loved every minute of the Democratic Convention. Don't elect those crazy Democrats. You're going to have riots in the streets. Elect me and I'll bring some order and quiet.
Vice President Hubert Humphrey won the Democratic nomination, but his old friend, then Senator Walter Mondale, remembers it didn't mean much.
He finally had his chance, and the nomination was worthless.
Worthless?
Well, it proved to be worth something, but at that time it looked like it was poisoned.
By contrast, Nixon's campaign ran with military-grade discipline. He traveled with an entourage of managers and message men, overseen by John Mitchell.
We do operate, I believe, in an orderly fashion, and that comes from preparation. We have planned it and programmed it and have had the time to carry it out.
It was all working. Nixon was up, way up in the polls, until September 30th, when Hubert Humphrey turned the tide with this speech.
I want to talk with you about Vietnam.
Humphrey repudiated Lyndon Johnson's war policy.
As president, I would stop the bombing of the North. as an acceptable risk for peace.
The announcement would narrow the polls dramatically. Nixon immediately had an unexpected order for his personal aide, Dwight Chapin.
Get President Johnson on the phone.
Who did he say that to?
He said it to me. I had no idea what to do, so I asked Rose Woods, who was Nixon's secretary. She said, call 456-1414 in Washington.
That's the White House number.
That's the White House number, and asked to speak to the president.
Mr. President? Yes. I'm awfully sorry to bother you. This is Dick Nixon. Yes, Dick.
President Johnson was recording the call as Nixon discussed Humphrey's speech.
This will be interpreted, as I'm sure you know, as a dramatic move away from the administration. It's my intention not to move in that direction.
Did you have a sense of how strange that call was?
I felt that it was one of the most intriguing political maneuvers that I had ever heard. For Richard Nixon to be calling Lyndon Johnson, and he's telling the president, I'm with you, not exactly the words, but implying it.
Mondale thinks it's evidence that Johnson might have been rooting against his own party's nominee, his own vice president.
Do you think Johnson wanted Humphrey to win?
Maybe. I'm not sure. I think at the end, the last 2 weeks, he wanted him to win. But I think the early part of the campaign, he was mad at Humphrey. He thought Humphrey wasn't being loyal enough.
Do you think Johnson wanted Nixon to win?
I thought so for a while because he was doing things to help Nixon.
But Johnson ended up helping Humphrey come within a hair of winning with this speech 5 days before the election.
I have now ordered that all air, naval, and artillery bombardment of North Vietnam cease.
I thought we had lost. Humphrey had momentum.
I thought we could make it.
Those must have been very heady days.
Yes, finally going to get a Minnesota president.
They almost did, but Nixon held on to win by just about 500,000 votes.
Richard Nixon goes over the top.
Richard Nixon had known bitter defeat in elections even closer than this, and he was magnanimous in victory. Nixon had Dwight Chapin set up a meeting with Humphrey just days after the election, and as the meeting ended, Chapin saw a side of Nixon
Have a visit with Vice President Humphrey.
Few others ever saw.
The men had their arms around one another. Humphrey was sobbing. Nixon was patting him on the back saying, Hubert, you know, everything is going to be okay. You and Muriel are going to have a great life. Humphrey chokes out, if there's anything that I can ever do, I want to be doing it for you. It was such a poignant moment.
The certificate of the electoral vote of the state of Alabama seems to be regular in form and authentic.
And now a page from our Sunday morning almanac, January 6th, 2001. The day a joint session of Congress certified the result of the most disjointed presidential election in our recent history.
Count the vote! Count one! It is over!
In some ways, it seems like yesterday. The passions of the most contentious election in more than a century were still all too fresh.
Every vote counts!
Although Democrat Al Gore won the popular vote nationwide by more than 500,000 votes, the Electoral College outcome came down to the disputed ballots and the hanging chads of Florida. The decision of a bitterly divided U.S. Supreme Court gave George W. Bush Florida's electoral votes. But when it came time to certify Florida's votes in Congress, not every member was prepared to go along.
I must object because of the overwhelming evidence of official misconduct.
Disenfranchised by Florida's
irony of ironies, the job of gaveling down the objectors and announcing the outcome fell to the loser, Vice President Gore.
George W. Bush of the state of Texas has received for President of the United States 271 votes. Al Gore of the state of Tennessee has received 266 votes.
As we said, in many ways it all seems like yesterday. In other ways, considering everything that's happened since, doesn't it seem like a long, long time ago?
He'll be the first African-American president of the United States, Barack Hussein Obama. By the way, Hussein is Arabic for good-looking. I'm just saying. When Obama was declared the winner, millions cheered, cried, and jam-packed the streets here and around the world. What did I do? I just sat there and stared at the television. I thought of my parents, who didn't live to see this happen. Did the word spread up there? I thought of my ancestors, slaves, considered property, not human beings. I thought of how I'm used to voting for white presidential candidates, choosing the one that seemed most sympathetic to black folks, and how I never thought a person of color would be president. Not in my lifetime.
Because of what we did on this day, election, at this defining moment, change has come to America.
I'm still trying to process this. Walking on the street yesterday, I looked at people's faces and thought, we have an African-American president now. Hey, everybody! The leader of the free world is a black man. He's in charge. Hey! My thoughts were so loud, I thought I was screaming. The thing is, I never thought that Barack Obama transcended race. What a dopey idea. It reminded me of when I was in college and one of my new friends told me tearfully that he didn't see me as black. He saw me as Nancy. And I cried too, thinking that college would be a holding hands on the mountaintop, Martin Luther King-like experience. Until I realized second semester that if he didn't see me as black, he was blind. Race, ethnicity, they're not the easiest things to talk about. Now, Barack Obama is a biracial African-American. Listen to what he says about race.
Working together, we can move beyond some of our old racial wounds. It requires all Americans to realize that your dreams do not have to come at the expense of my dreams.
He started an important conversation. President-elect Obama faces a country in a major economic crisis. Our confidence in the government is at a new low. Despite these challenges, look at the faces on Tuesday night. Hopeful, excited, there's an electricity. Change is in the air. And speaking of change, damn it, I'm gonna get myself in shape. Or something. Can the political parties in Washington reach across the aisle and achieve some common goals for our country? That's what the majority of Americans want. And for right now, it feels like, yes, we can.
Do you know where I can find the Electoral College?
No, I'm from Tennessee.
Go up 2 blocks and turn left.
I don't think anybody can answer that, can they?
Of course, the Electoral College isn't a place. It's the process by which the president is chosen by us. Sort of. When you and I vote in the presidential election, we aren't voting directly for the candidates. That would be too logical. We're voting for electors, actual people who pledge to vote for that candidate. Indiana, for example, has 11 electoral votes. So who are these electors?
I was the only person, I believe, in my congressional district in my party that filed for presidential elector.
Mike Schmuhl is a 29-year-old Indiana Democratic elector. If Barack Obama wins Indiana's popular vote on November 6th, Schmuhl, in a separate December election, will cast his vote for Obama, a vote that actually counts. So very few people know that if you're an Indiana Democrat voting, you think, for Barack Obama, that you're actually voting for Mike Schmuhl.
I think a number of people think it's strange that we don't directly elect our president and vice president.
The power of the Electoral College resides with the states. If the majority of people in Kentucky vote for Romney, then Kentucky will cast its 8 electoral votes for Romney. It may sound good in theory, but in practice, well, even a third grader can see there are problems. We're going to have a little election here. Who is voting for colored pencils? 10 votes for colored pencils. Who is voting for markers? 14 for markers. Markers have won the popular vote. And now we're going to have the real election. Naturally, they were disappointed. They thought we'd just had the election. But now it was time to warp these young minds by introducing them to the Electoral College. So we broke the class into 5 tables or states. The majority at each table, either markers or colored pencils, would get the table's 1 electoral vote. Of course, in real life, states have varying amounts of electoral votes, depending on the population. Table 1's elector, how do you cast your vote?
Markers.
Table 2's elector, how do you cast your vote?
Markers.
Table 3's elector.
Colored pencils.
In the end, the whole election came down to 1 state. Table 5's elector. This is it, guys. This will decide the whole thing. Elector, how do you cast your vote?
Color pencils.
What's that?
We're still cheating. Everybody should think it's unfair because it's not just about the elector's vote, it's about everybody's vote.
What happened to these kids has happened 4 times in presidential elections. John Quincy Adams, Rutherford B. Hayes, Benjamin Harrison, and of course George W. Bush all lost the popular vote but won the White House.
All over the world where presidents are elected, they're elected by direct popular vote.
Jamie Raskin is a Maryland state senator and professor of constitutional law at American University in Washington, D.C.
So let's recognize the fact that the president is a national figure, in fact, is the only elected official who reports to the whole country, and the whole country should elect the president together.
Defenders of the Electoral College say it forces candidates to campaign all over the country, not just in heavily populated big cities where they could run up the score. Except that they aren't campaigning all over the country. Candidates seem to spend all their time in the so-called swing states, where the polls are close and either candidate could end up taking, say, Ohio's 18 precious electoral votes. And they end up ignoring states like Texas and California, where the winner is already pretty much decided.
I'm fighting to create American jobs.
I need Ohio to help me become...
Which is why you could be forgiven for thinking Romney and Obama are running for president of Ohio.
96% of all the money spent in the last 2 presidential elections are spent in those 6 to 8 swing states.
Republican National Committee member Saul Anousis.
If you are a decidedly Republican state or a decidedly Democrat state, there's absolutely 0 reason for a presidential candidate to talk to you.
According to a new CBS News poll, 62% of Americans, both Democrats and Republicans, want to get rid of the Electoral College. The Founding Fathers who foisted this system on us were hardly more enthusiastic about it.
Thomas Jefferson was already calling it an ink blot on the Constitution. People have noted for centuries that it's deeply problematic.
So Jamie Raskin introduced a bill in Maryland that strips the Electoral College of its power without the heavy burden of amending the Constitution.
A very creative plan has emerged called the National Popular Vote Plan, which says, let's create a compact of states in which the states commit to cast their electors for the winner of the national vote rather than the winner in their state.
Here's how it works. Stay with me now. Maryland, the first state to agree to this plan, pledges to cast its electoral votes for the candidate who wins the national popular vote, regardless of how the citizens of Maryland vote. Several other states have agreed to this plan, but it only goes into effect when enough states sign on that together equal the 270 electoral votes needed to win the presidency. The plan's backers are almost halfway there. So this election, Maryland will still cast its electoral votes to the winner of the state's vote. But by 2016, it may be a different story. Another situation that might spell the end to the Electoral College even sooner. Right now, some polls project Romney winning the national popular vote, but Obama could still win the Electoral College vote. If this election is a repeat of the Bush-Gore standoff, don't be surprised to see the Electoral College unaccredited faster than you can say, one man, one vote.
Such a head-scratcher of an election, The Late Show's Stephen Colbert thought he better protect himself.
Doctor says I gotta wear this till the election's over, so I don't claw my eyes out.
Bingo! How many of us feel the same way?
Trump sues so many people, he's probably got platinum medallion status at the courthouse.
Instead of being the nation's nightlights, late-night comedy shows have become more like release valves.
Which is why Hillary has to own all the nasty things the haters say and run as the notorious HRC.
If we weren't laughing, we might be crying.
We've never had a major party female candidate before, which is what's one of the things extraordinary is that gets totally swamped under the pile of orange shag carpeting that is Donald Trump.
Colbert doesn't see his humor as piling on Donald Trump. He sees it as truth-telling.
He sounds on the campaign trail as much like he's like a mobster, and I'm in shipping. There's a nice democracy you got here. I'd hate to see something happen to it, okay? Maybe I'll concede on election day. Maybe I won't, okay?
Have a good time.
That's
all right.
Thank you so much.
Even Jon Stewart couldn't resist coming out of retirement to sit in for Colbert one night.
I thought Donald Trump was going to speak. Ivanka said that he was going to come out. She said he was really compassionate and generous, but then this angry groundhog came out. And
Stewart led the fake news movement that blended laugh-out-loud one-liners with news analysis.
Warning, you're going to hear the P word, and trust me, that word isn't presidential.
Samantha Bee and John Oliver, both Daily Show alums, continue that tradition.
Donald Trump views the truth like this lemur views the Supreme Court vacancy. I don't care about that in any way. Please f*** off, I have a banana.
To diffuse it all, the candidates themselves have tried getting in on the jokes.
What's the best way to reach you? Email?
Hillary Clinton appeared with Zach Galifianakis on Funny or Die's Between Two Ferns.
What happens if you become pregnant? Are we going to be stuck with Tim Kaine for 9 months? How does this work?
I could send you some pamphlets that might help you understand.
Donald Trump made fun of himself, too, on The Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon.
Me interviewing me, that's what I call a great idea.
Of course it's a great idea. We thought of it.
I am winning in every single poll taken outside of a Cracker Barrel.
But then came Alec Baldwin's Trump on Saturday Night Live.
In the media, every day I turn on the news and all of the newscasters are making me look so bad.
And how are we doing that?
By taking all of the things I say and all of the things I do and putting them on TV.
That sent the Donald straight to his Twitter account. Alec Baldwin portrayal stinks, he wrote. Media rigging election. He may actually have a bit of a point. There is a humor bias, turns out. Studies have proven it. Among a survey of 4 late-night shows, George Mason University found Donald Trump was the subject of 79% of the jabs, compared to just 21% for Hillary Clinton. But that 21% can still stick.
If only there was some way we could get a glimpse into the private side of Hillary Clinton. I don't know, read her emails or something.
Clinton's 3rd day off the campaign trail since 1953.
It starts off on a napkin, on a cocktail napkin.
Just the idea.
Just the idea.
But not everyone with a political funny bone is a hardcore liberal.
I am a member of the smallest minority in America, a conservative journalist. We are outnumbered about 100 to 1, and I think I just have to be that much more obnoxious to make up for it.
Michael Ramirez is a 2-time Pulitzer Prize-winning cartoonist. Lampooning Secretary Clinton's renewed email investigation, you'd think would be an absolute delight. But
as soon as Anthony Weiner approached on the landscape, believe me, 50 ideas that I cannot draw immediately came to mind.
It's all so absurd, some humorists aren't quite sure what to make of it.
It's a role reversal where the politician is being the clown and we're the ones folding our hands saying, "This is unacceptable, sir. You cannot do this."
Andy Borowitz writes the New Yorker's Borowitz Report, a parody of daily news that boasts headlines like these.
People are so distraught and so upset about where our country is that I've never seen this kind of visceral reaction where people will actually come up to me and say, "Thank God for comedy right now because it's the only thing that's getting me through."
It's okay to still be chuckling as you head to the polls on Tuesday. Just don't be laughing too hard not to go at all.
The serrated edge of our election divide runs right through a townhouse in Raleigh, North Carolina, right through the family of Joyce Woodhouse.
Here they are together.
Joyce's two sons, Brad and Dallas, grew up side by side.
You know, your mama's on Medicare, Brad.
But wound up on opposite sides of a split screen.
And the reality is,
Dallas is executive director of the North Carolina Republican Party, while Brad runs a pro-Clinton super PAC.
what she was saying.
Perhaps you've seen them before, biting each other's head off on cable news channels or taking phone calls on C-SPAN.
I got a minute here.
One from a very familiar voice.
Well, you're right, I'm from down south.
Oh, God, it's Mom.
And I disagree that all families are like ours.
You must have raised them differently.
I rocked them in the same rocking chair.
Or maybe you rocked one on your right side and one on your left side.
Must have been.
Shut up.
Their relationship is such a circus. Someone once did a whole documentary about it.
Oh, Dallas.
At least in the film, you could tell much of their banter was good-natured.
Oh, you can pull her hair.
But this was all shot before Trump versus Clinton.
Hey, buddy.
You know it's a girl, right?
Yeah, whatever.
I'm used to them getting angry and debating, but this has been the most difficult election. It was the first time that I had just got very sad about it.
Yeah. This past summer, as the election boiled, Joyce says her sons stopped talking to each other altogether.
I cried a lot.
And for too many Americans,
I did.
This is what our election has come to. It has driven us apart and muddled our minds. Today, we may think we hate the other side, but the fact is, more often than not, we actually love a lot of those people. In some cases, with all our hearts. But here's the good news. The brothers are talking again.
I pray that all families can come together and love each other and realize that family is the most important.
I think we can all vote for that.
We were normal, good, law-abiding citizens, and you guys did this to us!
We can now add January 6th, 2021, to that very short list of dates in American history that will live forever in infamy.
Shots fired! Shots fired!
Just how will history record this day?
This is our country, this is our house.
Was it a riot, domestic terrorism, an insurrection?
Well, we came this far, what do you say?
Our best hope is that it's at least a turning point. The symbol of our democracy shuddered under the pounding. Those watching at home shuddered too. Confederate flags, nooses, body armor, zip ties for handcuffs.
What we're seeing are a small number of extremists.
The images prompted President-elect Joe Biden to use a word we rarely hear from our leaders, certainly not about ourselves.
It borders on sedition.
Since Election Day, it's as if there had been a pot of political stew left on the stove to burn, simmering with conspiracy theories about the election.
In Philadelphia, they keep the votes of dead people secret.
Delusions not just glowing in the underbelly of the internet, but from the White House.
We can't have an election stolen like this.
And many members of Congress, too.
We know that this has really been a stolen election. I've seen the evidence.
They don't get to steal it from us. They don't get to tell us we didn't see what we saw.
A lot of these folks have been hearing for months now that the election has been stolen from them. They heard that it was going to be stolen from them before election night.
Renee DiResta is a researcher at the Stanford Internet Observatory that, in part, studies the use of misinformation online.
Donald Trump won this election.
They had been fed a consistent, misleading, false narrative alongside calls from the more extreme elements that said, we have to do something about this. The idea that that was just going to somehow stay as some online message board commentary is just wildly naive.
Because it had real-world
consequences.
There is no distinction anymore between online and offline.
All of us here today do not want to see our election victory stolen by emboldened radical left Democrats, which is what they're doing, and stolen by the fake.
With just hours before Joe Biden's victory was set to be certified,
We will never give up. We will never concede.
came a battle cry.
You don't concede when there's theft involved.
Up on Capitol Hill, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell had lost two. Georgia's runoff election this past week would soon leave him in the minority. And yet,
this election were overturned,
he was prepared to accept,
by mere allegations from the losing side,
what the president couldn't.
Our democracy would enter a death spiral. I object to the election.
Still, 8 Republican senators and 139 Republican House members were still intent on stalling the inevitable, announcing they would object to the certification of Joe Biden as the winner.
What does it say to the nearly half the country that believes this election was rigged if we vote not even to consider the claims of illegality and fraud in this election?
Outside, the tidal wave of denial began pouring down Pennsylvania Avenue. It crashed onto the steps of the Capitol and seeped all the way to the doors of the House chamber itself. Guns were drawn, representatives fled, people died, including U.S. Capitol Police Officer Brian Sicknick, a 12-year veteran of the force. Scores of arrests have been made in the wake of the mayhem, and the FBI promises there will be more. It is into the teeth of that America the next administration is about to walk.
Nobody looks at this country and says, I wish my government worked like that.
Ian Bremmer is a geopolitical strategist of sorts. He founded the Eurasia Group, which advises clients on political risk.
In 1989, when the wall came down, we won the Cold War because people around the world looked to the United States as an example of good governance. You can't say that today.
This past week, he says, was just the latest tarnish on our reputation.
Anyone that thinks that we are suddenly going to be welcomed back as America's the global policeman, we're the architect of global trade, we're the cheerleader of global values, we have squandered that legacy.
The Senate will come to order.
Congress did resume its constitutional duties that night.
To those who wreaked havoc in our capital today, you did not win.
Presided over by the outgoing vice president. There were calls for restraint heading into the all-night session.
The best way we can show respect for the voters who are upset is by telling them the truth.
We brought this hell upon ourselves.
With their halls and offices around them laying in ruin. Some of those who had objected to certifying the election changed their minds. Others didn't.
Irregardless.
Didn't matter.
The votes for president
by 3:46 a.m., the counting
Joseph R. Biden Jr.
was over.
Of the state of Delaware has received 306 votes.
In the days that followed, whispers of declaring Mr. Trump unfit for office turned into actual discussions about invoking the 25th Amendment. House Democrats drafted an article of impeachment against the president that could be acted on as early as tomorrow.
He must be removed from office.
By Friday, Twitter had banned the president. His more than 88 million followers will have to find him somewhere else. Facebook and Instagram blocked him too. Those watching the collapse from inside the White House urged the president to publicly grasp a reality that some are still not sure he necessarily believes.
My focus now turns to ensuring a smooth, orderly, and seamless transition of power.
That did not, apparently, include attending his rival's inaugural. He announced he would pass on that.
The vice president is welcome to come. We'd be honored to have him there.
While Mr. Trump seemed to accept that he'd lost the battle, he still insisted the war is far from over.
To all of my wonderful supporters, I know you are disappointed, but I also want you to know that our incredible journey is only just beginning.
Abraham Lincoln once talked of the choice between rule and ruin. That was tested this past week. But unity isn't some kind of unicorn. You might remember a moment after 9/11, when the Capitol was spared an attack. Democrats stood next to Republicans and spontaneously broke into a chorus of God Bless America. Whatever acrimony existed, whatever perceived sins had been committed, melted under a common purpose to defend democracy. That was 2 decades ago. Hardly ancient history. At least, we hope.
My home, sweet home.
An angry mob running roughshod and unchecked through the Capitol and onto the floor of the United States Senate. A scene as once unthinkable as airplanes crashing into buildings.
They could have blown the building up. They could have killed us all. They could have destroyed the government. We dodged a major bullet yesterday.
The barriers erected and manned by the Capitol Police were little more than speed bumps to the angry mob.
They had these pathetic little barricades up beforehand, and what they should have done is had much more robust capabilities well in advance of the 6th of January.
Michael Chertoff, head of Homeland Security during the George W. Bush administration, says the Capitol Police bear primary responsibility.
This strikes me as having been a real dereliction by the Capitol Police.
But simple dereliction doesn't explain this statement by D.C. Police Chief Robert Conte.
There was no intelligence that suggested there would be a breach of the U.S. Capitol.
In fact, social media was full of storm the Capitol rhetoric, including a tweet from President Trump predicting it will be wild.
The hoaxes and the lies.
And then there was the rally outside the White House where the president and his ally Rudy Giuliani riled up the crowd.
Let's have trial by combat.
If you read the newspaper, you knew that there was a serious possibility of a threat against the Capitol. Let's go wild. Bring your guns. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that that suggests a serious threat to the integrity of the Capitol.
This was not a failure to connect the dots, but a failure to believe the dots.
Whether they underestimated the threat or believed because they were Trump supporters they weren't going to be a problem, that was a very serious error and can never be allowed to be repeated.
Was this cultural bias? If it's Black Lives Matter, there's a real threat of violence here. But if it's just almost all white Trump supporters, no problem.
Well, certainly that's a legitimate question to ask. They need to ask questions about whether there was conscious or unconscious bias, or even some, political spin for some of the people in the Capitol Police.
Democratic Congressman James Clyburn offered a more sinister explanation.
Somebody on the inside of those buildings were complicit in this.
The need for answers is urgent. There are already social media calls for more attacks surrounding the inauguration. The president is vowing we will not be silenced, and one of his supporters warned, many of us will return on January 19th carrying our weapons.
Buckle up. I'm afraid we're going to see some very scary activity over the next weeks and months.
Altissima tensione a Washington. I sostenitori di Donald Trump tentano di occupare il Congresso dove...
Не обошлось без мародерства. Из здания Конгресса в качестве трофея...
بدأت تتغير وهي fight for Trump.
Translating and interpreting those events unfolding on Capitol Hill took place in real time on television broadcasts around the world.
They shouted pro-Trump slogans and waved U.S. flags as they rode.
In India, reporter Smita Sharma says at first she almost mistook the scenes for some new fictional TV series.
Frankly, it looked like I was watching maybe a mismatch of a Homeland Season 9 with a Designated Survivor new series on Netflix.
You couldn't believe what you were seeing?
It was difficult to believe.
A country of more than 1.3 billion people, India has an interest in this story. It's the world's most populous democracy.
At the end of the day, we still look up to America for at least being a leader of the democratic principles. And if it is weakened internally, then a lot of the other countries will find it even more justified to carry on and move away from democratic principles.
For us, it's very easy to understand a politician that does not recognize losing.
Ana Paula Ordorica is a journalist in Mexico. a country whose populist president has not publicly condemned the assault on Capitol Hill.
What is not easy to understand is the enablers, having senators questioning these results, and having so many Americans speaking about fraud.
It broke the image that people have of a kind of picture-perfect Washington and all these rituals that unfold, with military precision.
American writer Anne Applebaum, author of Twilight of Democracy, was watching from her home near Warsaw, Poland.
All of us are used to seeing demonstrations on the mall. What was different about this demonstration, if you can call it that, was that it was a demonstration against American democracy itself.
Her new book looks at anti-democratic trends, sometimes fueled by conspiracy theories and the lure of nationalism, populism, and authoritarianism.
One of the ways in which the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, the Venezuelans, and others use photographs of America is to try and shore up their own regime.
The message from authoritarian states, from those powers, is look at democracy, this is just too messy?
Yes, Putin, Xi, Maduro, they tell their people, you don't want to live in a democracy. Democracies are shambolic. Democracies are chaotic.
What happened in Washington really showed that there are some problems with democracy, and it is showing weakness, said Hu Xijin. He's editor-in-chief of China's Global Times, part of the state-backed media run by the ruling Communist Party.
You have penned and released stinging editorials. The Global Times has really jumped on this story. Why?
Are the words too harsh? Hu asked. Can you give me an example?
In one editorial, you say Capitol mob represents an internal collapse of the U.S. political systems. That's pretty harsh.
I do not think America is collapsing, he said, but the Capitol Hill incident has shown collapse within the U.S. political system. This headline in a Kenyan paper taunts, who is the Banana Republic now? Anne Applebaum says the democratic world should be setting an example for those in other countries who are pushing for basic rights.
The right to vote, the right to have a judge in a court who's independent from politics. All those things that we take for granted and they work so hard for may become harder to obtain.
Is the U.S. any less trustworthy than it was before?
I don't think so because of the reaction.
Lia Quartapelle is a member of Italy's parliament and serves on the Foreign Affairs Committee.
The entire system reacted also to preserve rule of law, democracy, will of the people.
She was encouraged to see the U.S. Congress get right back to work that same night, demonstrating that in a democracy, it's the institution itself that wields the most power.
In democracy, things can go wrong. Sometimes they go badly wrong, but they can be corrected, which is something that never happens in any other part of the world that is not a democracy.
The January 6th hearings that ended Thursday have taken place during the same summer months that 235 years ago, the founders devoted to writing the Constitution. On this very day, in 1787, the delegates in Philadelphia discussed the creation of the Electoral College, the process of picking presidents that rioters tried to interrupt on January 6th, 2021. Like this summer's hearings, the founders obsessed about a chief executive who would use the power of office to stay in power. The founders knew humans were deeply flawed, but in the end they knew the experiment would only succeed if some share of those who participated in government had a moral core. Is there no virtue among us? Asked James Madison. If there be not, we are in a wretched situation. No form of government can render us secure. The hearings showed that there is virtue among us. The Capitol Police, Justice Department officials, Republican governors and state officials, Vice President Pence, White House aides, all showed it. But like the final episode of a hit drama, you can feel the seeds of a sequel that will challenge the heroes all over again, because many of the political habits that led to January 6th are displayed in the response of Trump loyalists to the hearings about January 6th. Diversion, distraction, lying.
It's why conservative Judge Michael Luttig testified that Donald Trump and his supporters
are a clear and present danger to American democracy.
The hearing this past week offered a clear example of the instinct of accommodating the inexcusable. The committee outlined how on January 6th, President Trump did nothing for 3 hours to stop the rioting at the Capitol, despite the presidential obligation to preserve, protect, and defend. But Donald Trump was like a fire chief who did nothing more than warm his face in the flames. By the standard of any profession, a failure this grave would disqualify a person from the job. But to speak that plain truth out loud in the party Donald Trump leads would cripple your reputation in the party just as it has Liz Cheney's. Instead, the conditioned response is to distract. So the office of the third most powerful member of House Republican leadership tweeted about the hearing, "All hearsay." It wasn't. Trump officials were under oath, recounting their direct experience trying to get the president to act. But by attacking the witnesses, Trump defenders admit they have no evidence he did his job. At issue is more than the actions or inaction of a single president, but the standards of the presidency and whether a large portion of those who the founders relied on to maintain those standards have become practiced in lowering them or casting them aside entirely.